Welcome to ESG in the Capital Markets, a special presentation of the CSE in partnership with MNP. Join us as we explore environmental, social, and governance strategies and their importance in the global business landscape. The push towards sustainability is resonating across all industries and sectors. Many publicly traded companies are turning to ESG to differentiate themselves among investors and consumers. But how should these strategies be implemented? And what are the most important factors to consider? We will explore ESG fundamentals for publicly traded companies and include a special focus on cannabis and mining. Where education meets opportunity, this is ESG in the Capital Markets. Welcome to ESG in the Capital Markets, Day 2, brought to you by the Canadian Securities Exchange in partnership with MNP. This two-day event will look at the subject of environmental, social, and governance strategies from a macro level, while today we will provide key insights regarding ESG in cannabis and mining spaces. Through this session, you'll learn about selecting topics to focus on and who to consult to make the best decision for your organization in the cannabis and mining sector. Mary Larson, partner at MNP, and Edward Olson, leader environmental, social, and governance at MNP, will lead you through this discussion. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session of ESG for publicly traded companies, a deep dive into the mining industry edu series. If you've seen our first general presentation, that's great. If not, I would highly recommend that you go back and look at some of the general concepts around ESG that we presented there. My name is Edward Olson, and I lead the sustainability practice here at MNP. I'm also a regional leader of our enterprise risk services practice. My background and training is that I am a chartered accountant by trade, and I've been involved in many different roles and business models regarding sustainability over the last 20 years. This has covered everything from sustainability auditing to environmental management systems, carbon credits, including even being down to having the responsibility for running a company and setting its strategy and operations related to alternative energy. I am a member of CPA Canada's Sustainability Reporting Advisory Committee and sit on a global ESG advisory committee with the Institute of Internal Auditors. This is going to be a great topic today, and I'm so happy to be joining my esteemed colleague, Mary Larson. Mary, if you could introduce yourself, that would really be great.
Great. Yes, thanks, Ed. Yes, we're very excited to be giving this talk today to you and sharing some insights around the mining sector and ESG. I am a partner with MNP and lead the National Organizational Renewal Practice, which includes strategy, organization design, ESG strategy, and DE&I, among other service lines. I have been involved with sustainability as an issue, strategic issue with my clients for about 20 years. I was one of the founding members of the Finance and Sustainability Issue, which was designed to help financial executives and investors to become more knowledgeable about ESG. And we launched actually a certification program through Concordia University about 18 years ago. I've also been involved with several companies, including the Business Development Bank of Canada, helping them become B Corps, and have also led a number of efforts to help impact investment organizations develop their strategies. So with that, I think let's dive in. The objectives of the session today are to talk a little bit about the big ESG trends that you in the mining industry are experiencing. They're specific and they are big. We're also going to identify ESG issues as they relate to the mining industry and talk about some mitigation strategies, things that we're seeing various players tackle to address these ESG issues. And then finally, we're going to spend some time talking about regulations and standards that are being used and how you can go about adopting and implementing some of these standards.
Well, if I could kick things off based on those objectives, Mary, we're here to talk about ESG. So let's be clear on what ESG really is. ESG is truly a means to evaluate factors. And those factors are on how advanced companies are with regards to sustainability. Understanding these factors is essential to mapping out how many non-financial factors really do have a financial impact. So what are some of these? Well, it's encompassed right now on screen between these three different pillars. The environmental factors themselves include the contribution a company makes to climate change through greenhouse gas emissions, along with waste management and energy efficiency. Given renewed efforts to combat global warming, cutting emissions and decarbonizing is becoming more important. Social, that whole social pillar, includes human rights, labor standards in even the supply chain, any exposure to illegal child labor or modern day slavery, and more routine issues like adherence to workplace health and safety. The strength of your social strategy actually, it's risks if your company is well integrated with the local community, and therefore you have a social license to operate. If you don't have that, there's a risk in your ESG strategy that you need to consider. And when you look at governance, that far right pillar, it refers to that set of rules or principles that define rights, responsibilities, and expectations between different stakeholders in the governance of companies like you attending today. A well-defined corporate governance system can be used to balance or even align interests between stakeholders and can work as a tool to support a company's long-term strategy. But here's what I want you to think about. These concepts themselves aren't new. It's not new to say that we need to care about the environment, and it's not new to say that we should treat people well, both employees and the communities where we operate. What is really new is the approach to and this whole embodiment of a change to adjust course. And this change of course, this is a reorientation of capital, prioritization of even efforts. It's strategic alignment of partnerships. So, Mary, with what I've been talking about, how did we even get here?
Well, it's been a long journey. There's no doubt about that. This whole idea of corporate social responsibility started in the 1970s, and I think it was to some extent a response to the single-minded focus on shareholders and this notion that companies only existed to benefit shareholders. And people began to say, well, there's got to be something beyond that, because companies do more than necessarily just enrich their shareholders, or they ought to. I mean, after all, they employ people. There is some responsibility for the fact that the products that they produce ought to be safe and promote health, and that working environments ought to be ones that promoted security and safety on the part of employees. And so this led into beginnings of a discussion that led in 1994 to a radical idea, which was that we actually want to measure a triple bottom line of a company's performance. So yes, there's the financial bottom line, but there ought to be a people account and a planet account, if you will. And this idea was very slow to take root. In fact, I think a lot of people thought it was kind of a silly idea until 2005, when the United Nations began to get very active on this, and PRI was developed, and the notion of who cares wins, study by the UN Global Compact, which concluded that better investment leads to more sustainable societies. And there began to be work done to demonstrate that a focus on sustainability actually led to more favorable financial results. And with that, in 2015, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were defined. And these were 17 sustainable goals around things ranging from health, education, access to health care, the rights of women, and a number of other things around safe water and safe air and safe working environments that were developed with typically a 15-year goal horizon, so that the implementation would actually start to be undertaken on a global basis and hopefully to be completed by 2030, with some goals extending far beyond that. But the world began to take notice, and I think what's happened significantly with COVID is that people have gotten very serious about some of these issues. People have had time to think about this. And of course, the whole issue of climate change has become now broadly accepted. And in fact, we know that we're on the nasty side of all of that, with a great sense of urgency to do something about it. So that's the evolution and kind of the story. And do you want to talk a little bit about some of the things that are really putting pressure on ESG at this point?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. I would actually say to understand ESG is to understand the drivers that are influencing change. And I'm only going to address a couple of these that you see on screen right now. If I just pick the first one being banking and financial institutions, let's talk about the principles for responsible banking. It was created in 2019 by the United Nations Environment Program Finance Initiative. And the principles, they're a unique framework for ensuring that signatory banks, that their strategy and practices align with the vision that society has set out for its future within what Mary was talking about here, the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. Just since inception in 2019, those signatories, they number 229 banks that represent close to 2 billion customers worldwide, that represent almost 60 trillion in global banking assets. So the primary focus here is to drive change by the banking community. And that's through a positive contribution to people and the planet that society expects. So is anything happening? Well, yes, there is global adoption of net zero financed emissions. And those commitments come from most major global banks. In fact, if you take that lens and look at Canada, most, if not all, of our largest financial institutions here of Canada have already committed to net zero financed emissions, which really means accessing capital will come with more strings attached and expectations than has ever been experienced before. And that this change will start heating up as banks seek to meet those global public commitments that they have made. But if we switch gears a little bit here, we can look at governments. Well, there is much happening globally. Let's just take a look specifically at Canada. In 2016, we had our approved strategy called the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. We can then look at the Canadian Securities Administrators in their staff notice 51-358 that addresses reporting on climate change related risks. And we know that earlier this year, the Ontario Capital Markets Modernization Task Force, well, they're asking for more to be done, more stringent climate related reporting than what was previously required. And how just this year, the federal government passed Bill C-12, and that bill is called the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. So now this bill places into law Canada's commitment to reaching net zero carbon emissions. So governments and their public policy positions are really driving change. If I switch gears just again, human resources and workforce strategies are important for attracting and retaining skilled resources. If we dissect all age brackets and just look at millennials, a third of those millennials have already left their companies for a more inclusive one, which highlights, do you even have a robust diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy? Because if you don't, you're running the risk of both attracting and retaining your human resources and skilled resources for your business. Just last comment, if I could. If we consider accounting standard setting bodies, I'm keeping a close eye on the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation. I said earlier that I sit on CPA Canada's Sustainability Reporting Advisory Committee, and we had the head of the IFRS Foundation come to speak to us. Their focus is set this year in November in Glasgow at the United Nations Climate Change Conference, which is also known as COP26. And this is when they are going to outline their roadmap for the creation of a sustainability standards board, and that this board will set expectations globally and what's going to be included in their standards, while this will drive the need for a more formal approach to sustainability reporting that will eventually become mandatory. So Mary, I just scratched at a few things there, but I should probably pass it back to you right now.
Right, so here what we're going to do now is sort of switch gears and talk about specifically the mining industry. And as I said earlier, we're going to talk about the trends that we're looking at, the ESG impacts and considerations, and then go into this discussion of mitigation strategies to deal with the ESG impacts that we're looking at, and then talk about SASB considerations that are applicable to the mining industry specifically. And I just want to mention that we use SASB throughout this document, partly because it deals with all three aspects of ESG, and also because there is a framework that is highly accessible and easy to use, and it's a good place to start. So there are other standards that we might have delved into, but we wanted to keep things relatively straightforward and comprehensible.
And if you don't know what those top global ESG standards or frameworks are, we addressed that in our first general presentation. So if you haven't seen it, by all means, please go and watch that. If we just look at overarching trends, for years, the focus of the extractive sector was really on lowest cost for maximum production output. And that this focus turned, I would say, a blind eye to many environmental, social, and governance issues that impacted many different stakeholders. A turn in regulation really did put a spotlight on the health and safety of employees working in and living near mining operations. We can even look south of the border and see how the Federal Mine Safety and Health Act in the latter part of the 70s, it was created to enforce compliance with mandatory safety and health standards. And it was meant to be a means to eliminate fatal accidents, reduce the frequency and severity of non-fatal accidents, to minimize health hazards, and really to promote improved safety and health conditions in regulated mines. If we look at Canada, we have the Towards Sustainable Mining initiative that was launched in 2004. And this initiative is a world-recognized sustainable standard that is helping to build capacity within the global mining industry. And participation in TSM is mandatory for members of the Mining Association of Canada. And it was established in an effort to drive performance improvement in environmental and social issues. And at present, it is only mandatory within Canada, but many companies are voluntarily implementing these standards in their overseas operations. And I don't need to say it again, but I should just do this as a reminder. There is a definitive link to attracting and retaining employees, to accessing capital, to attracting investors, and ensuring sound sustainability practices that I spoke of earlier in this presentation. So Mary, maybe you can lead us into some of the environmental impacts.
Right, and if we look at the next page, in fact, 2 pages, I think you all are aware that, and we certainly are not trying to tell you something that you already don't know, but there are different environmental impacts depending on the mining approach that's being taken. So if you have open pit mining, a lot of the environmental impacts have to do with exposure of rock that releases radioactive elements and things that happen during the separation of the ores, and also deforestation is a common issue. If you're looking at underground mining, there are a whole bunch of issues around the tailings. Mercury and other compounds can be used and in facilitating ores, and very often what happens is these get released into the atmosphere and nearby water. There are problems with sedimentation in rivers that may be near these mines through the use of hydraulic pumps and suction dredges. And of course, deforestation happens in these cases as well. If we go to the next page, in situ leach mines will have a sort of different kind of situation because the acids that are used to dissolve the ore bodies can dissolve minerals and metals in the host rock. And these fluids can create concentrations of metals and radioactive isotopes in water sources. And then there's mining wastewater that can result in the acidification of surrounding environments. Heap leaching can result in a number of other issues. Some is the release of toxic solutions into the surrounding ecosystem, and leach ponds that directly affect wildlife and could cause mortality. And then brine mining, extraction, and evaporation of brine solutions to remove elements and compounds can contaminate nearby bodies of water if the brine areas are not sufficiently protected. So there are all sorts of things that can happen. And so what we're seeing is these issues around throughout across the mining sector is, basically high carbon output. The mining industry is dependent on the use of fossil fuels primarily, and these generate the energy for the operations. There are certainly, as Ed has mentioned, some countries that are imposing regulations on emissions, including ourselves, but a lot of companies in which mining companies operate don't have such regulations. There are issues around erosion and species endangerment. I've talked a little bit about these in the past couple of slides. It's invasive. There's no doubt that this mining is invasive. It can cause damage to landscapes, and these damages can exceed the limits of the mine itself. And so impacts to landscapes persist for many years and can result in the death of plants and animals. And then there's high water use and wastewater. Almost all modern mining techniques use a large amount of water for extraction, processing, and waste disposal. And a lot of situations involve wastewater from these processes not necessarily being dealt with in as best way possible. So these are the kinds of things that we're seeing associated with mining, specifically related to the environment. So what are companies doing about these kinds of situations? Well, there are at least 5 things that we're seeing as mitigating strategies. One is just reducing the use of water, and this can happen through recycling of wastewater and reducing water demands for operations because we're using recycled water, or because we found ways to actually minimize the use of water in the process. There are examples of using alternative energy sources, particularly in places where solar or wind power are available. And there are many mines that have made use of investments in wind and solar generation, installing generators and batteries so that they can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Proper waste disposal, this is an issue that's been around for eons, frankly, but I think that right now we're seeing increased investment in equipment that will turn waste into reusable materials, and in finding circular economy models to enable the disposal of these materials in an economically viable way. And recycling is another opportunity for mines. Certainly closing shut down mines is critical. So decommissioning the mines, making sure that the egress and entry into the mine is controlled, that the land has been dealt with in a way that other things can be done with the mine, and that all waste has been dealt with in a safe and responsible way. And then finally, replenishing the environment, actually proactively reintroducing ecosystems, plants, animals, etc., to make sure that the land can be used in perpetuity in a productive way. So we're seeing a lot of these kinds of activities, and the more people hear about these and talk about them, the better, obviously. And the good news is that technology investment is investment in technology is going right along with this. So Ed, I think we'll talk a little bit, you could talk a little bit about the social side of the mining sector.
Thanks, Mary. Actually, there are many topics to address within the social pillar of ESG. These are just a handful that we're going to discuss with you today. If we look at involuntary resettlement, large mining companies have been known to economically and physically displace communities as a result of mining projects. This brings with it the emotional and financial distress for communities and their residents. Communities where you operate are a key stakeholder when considering ESG strategies. And this is why your sustainability strategy must specifically identify who are your internal and external stakeholders. If we look at Indigenous land use, Indigenous communities have strong connections with the natural environment and the land base. Mining companies seeking to operate on traditional lands face really complex issues and often lack the knowledge required to address traditional rights. And we also know that mining companies have been found, even in consultation, not to disclose Indigenous opposition to projects and pushing forward regardless with projects, even though they know that there is the Indigenous opposition to what's being carried out, which really does highlight the need for a more robust strategy to appropriately address, I would even say, Indigenous communities and their interests. And health concerns. Mines are known to release harmful contaminants into the air and surrounding water sources, and that these contaminants can be harmful to the health of communities living near these mines, including having direct impact on employees at the mine sites. So the good thing is that companies are inventorying these concerns and impacts already today, which shows a mature sustainability practice for the S pillar of ESG. Let's think about some mitigation strategies on what we just discussed. In working with Indigenous communities, this is actually about working with rights holders, and to be clear, they're even more than stakeholders. This means going beyond just the traditional duty to consult. It includes inclusivity and collaboration as even aligned with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or commonly referred to as UNDRIP. I did a presentation earlier this year and conducted some research on companies and whether they had formal Indigenous peoples policies. And I was actually surprised to learn, disappointed really, how few actually had taken this as an important initiative and created the necessary policies. You need a formally documented and well understood framework for your company to apply in engaging with Indigenous communities. At the end of last year, Bill C-15 was introduced with the intent to create a roadmap for government and Indigenous peoples to work together. This enactment provides that the government of Canada must take all measures necessary to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with UNDRIP and must prepare and implement an action plan to achieve the objectives of the declaration. And this must be considered by companies looking to do business in addressing their ESG strategies while ensuring Indigenous stakeholders' interests are deeply embedded in the S pillar of ESG. And a final thought on the Indigenous is companies need to also understand that one size doesn't fit all. What may be successful with one Indigenous nation may not actually be successful with another. And last here, Mary, around the health and safety side, there are already strict regulations on miner health and safety. And it is necessary to ensure this continues to be monitored and disclosed. And considering the health and safety of communities, mining operations should continue making proactive efforts to reduce the risk of contaminants being released into the surrounding environment when you talked about the environmental pillar. So imperative for companies here to inventory and understand the significance of their impact on the environment, including being clear as to those stakeholders who should be consulted, such as employees, communities, Indigenous peoples, as well as considering biodiversity. So, Mary, enough on the social for right now. Can you take us through even some of those governance considerations?
Right, and to some extent, all of the issues that we've talked about so far relate to governance in some way, shape, or form. All of the environmental and social issues and mitigating strategies that we've talked to have to be somehow tracked through a governance process and governance system. But let's talk specifically about 4 governance considerations that really are terribly important. One of them is the mismanagement of third-party relationships. And it's quite clear that many mining companies have experienced some challenges with human rights issues associated with indirect labor. And we saw a situation a couple of years ago with modern slavery, basically, in Northern Africa. There were some issues discussed in the Globe and Mail today in Tigray, mining taking place there. And so how do you actually overseas control the work of contractors who in fact are hiring the people who work in the mines that you're operating? And one of the problems is that it's very hard to build in oversight and to take actions in a way that will actually protect human rights of these indirect laborers and the treatment of citizens in vulnerable communities. This takes dollars and people to do this. And so historically, this has been something where investment on the part of the mining companies has not necessarily been focused. The other issue that's very much related to this mismanagement of third-party relationships is some of the ethical challenges. And these things kind of overlap and become a little murky, but the notion of conflict minerals. And these are often specified because they involve some level of human rights violations. And we've seen this with the diamond industry and gold and other minerals. And I think one of the things that happens here is that reporting very often has been at the corporate level rather than on an asset-by-asset basis. And so governance bodies such as boards and senior executives don't necessarily have a line of sight into what is going on at the coalface, to use an expression that I guess is quite apt given the industry that we're talking about. Lack of financial management and oversight. This is a clear issue where in a company where operations are taking place in countries that have weak legislation on the management of mining assets and the use of tax and royalty revenues, and if that is, the oversight doesn't exist, then money can go awry. And the money that is supposed to be being used to protect safety or to reclaim land or to invest in community development may go into other people's hands. And if you don't have the financial management oversight, then you run the risk of these kinds of things happening and being basically guilty of corrupt practices. And then finally, reputational damage in general. All of these things contribute to reputational damage. And mining companies have been the subject of issues related to human rights, corruption, bribery, environmental damage, all the things that we've been talking about for the past few minutes. And in a more concrete way, just beyond reputational damage, liabilities and fines can be imposed that can be very, very costly. So in the context of this kind of situation, what can companies do? What we see on the next page is a number of things. Implementation of policies, processes, and tools. And so investment in clearly defining policies, overseeing the governance structures locally, and creating tools that actually apply within a mining company's operation and across the entire supply chain. So including the acquisition of labor and materials that are used in the mine, and making sure that human rights controls are absolutely in place and being overlooked. Not overseen, sorry, not overlooked. Asset level reporting, I talked about this a few minutes ago. So not just reporting at the corporate level, but actually investing time and energy into overseeing the operations on an asset by asset basis. so that boards and senior executives can see what's going on a local basis. Adherence to financial management and oversight. So if there are international standards, or deciding that even if you're operating in a country that doesn't have the strictest standards, applying Canadian or US or international standards to operations can promote financial transparency, make sure that you've got best practice governance and regarding the use of taxes and royalty revenues. Some companies have even set up independent foundations in vulnerable communities to help share the wealth and make sure that the money is going towards the uses that it was intended to go towards. These things improve the livelihood of community members living in mining regions, and this can go a long way to improving the reputation of mining companies. And then finally, highlighting ESG initiatives. We found, Ed and I have found across a number of sectors, a lot of companies are doing a lot of things and they don't talk about them. And we're not quite sure why, but if you are doing things that really are going to be helping either from an environmental, social, or governance standpoint, then talk about those, report on them with data, by the way, so that you can prove that you've actually done these things. And actually, another thing that's very important is taking a look at ESG and looking at it from the standpoint, this can be a competitive advantage. Yes, we might have to spend more money, but over the long run, we'll avoid fines. We will be allowed to operate in communities. It'll be much easier for us to deal with communities and to win the rights to actually carry on business. So those are some things that we are seeing, and they're very, very powerful. I think we're going to turn our attention to standards and frameworks now. And one of the things that we wanted to do is just talk a little bit about SASB. And SASB is a set of standards that can apply to the mining industry. And there is a materiality map that was used. We used it for the purpose of this document in this session because it does look at all three dimensions of ESG, as I mentioned. And it actually provides examples of metrics, not only for mining, but across 70 plus industry types. So it is a very, very convenient and easy to use, kind of user-friendly approach to looking at standards. And so these metrics are things we're going to talk about really briefly on the following pages. And if we look at environment, some of the general issues categories are GHG emissions, air quality, energy management. So for example, total energy consumed, percentage of grid electricity, percentage of renewal, water management. There are numbers of incidents of non-compliance associated with water quality permits. This gives you an idea of the kind of specificity that for the environment, for example, SASB will lay out things that a mining company could do to measure or put in place to measure their performance along the environment. And similarly, if we looked at social capital and human rights and community relations, some of the metrics that are being discussed are percentage of proved and provable reserves in or near areas of conflict, percentage of provided and probable reserves in or near indigenous lands. And so to the degree that these are reported on and discussed, you can actually enhance social capital. Human capital, percentage of active workforce covered under collective bargaining agreements, for example. And for leadership and governance, business ethics, a description of the management system for prevention, corruption, and bribery throughout the value chain. So SASB is providing guideposts for companies like yourselves to begin to tackle this very complex domain of ESG.
If I could just step in here and talk about some additional standards, Mary. If we look at those which are applicable to this industry, there is continued effort to reduce risks associated with mining and the consumers of outputs. And on a global scale, help fight the use of forced labor and the financing of armed conflict, regulations put onus on sourcing standards, help break the link between conflict and the illegal exploitation of minerals, and helps to put an end to the exploitation and abuse of local communities, including mine workers. And it's great to see that it supports local development as well. If we just look at the responsible gold mining principles, those principles cover each of the ESG pillars of sustainability, linking ethical conduct to understanding impacts within your own business and that of your supply chain, to identifying and protecting the health and safety of your workforce and surrounding communities, including all those that you interact with, to environmental stewardship and understanding impacts to biodiversity and natural resource consumption in both existing operations. And you even brought up, Mary, too, the whole idea of closed sites, those locations that are closed through your sustainable and responsible approach to site remediation and reclamation. And even if we take a look at the International Council on Mining and Minerals, ethical business activities are even built into decision-making processes and actually should be. How human rights are respected, health and safety performance is ensured, operations continue with a lens on continual improvement. So what is your approach to continual improvement, including the treatment and protection of biodiversity, again, that keeps coming up. Each of these additional standards provides guidance to help you on your ESG journey, creating solutions now to address ESG topics that ensure long-term sustainable operations and outcomes. Just looking at and doing a general review of your environment, take a brief look at the mining industry. Doing that can be a great exercise to benchmark your activities and assess where the industry is leading through commitments to sustainability and ensuring meaningful consultation with key stakeholders, both internal and external. Sustainability is not just for large mining companies. It applies to everyone in the industry and it applies globally. And lastly, how are you addressing waste? Do you have commitments? Where can you take meaningful steps to create real change? These are just some things for our participants to keep in mind. Mary, what else should they be thinking about?
Well, I think one of the things that we believe in strongly is that the whole process of dealing with and addressing ESG is a journey. And it starts with really understanding the nature of your business, the footprint of your business, if you will. So where is the business operating? What are the primary sustainability concerns? And how do your products and services affect sustainability? And talking to stakeholders, identifying the stakeholders, first of all, who are the stakeholders that are going to matter the most? And these can be internal and external, so clearly communities in which you operate. And having conversations with those people, understanding your footprint, allows you to identify the most critical ESG topics that you need to address. And what we encourage our clients to do is not try to address 15 of them. Typically, there are 4 or 5 that are really going to make a difference to your business and to your stakeholders. And to assess the materiality, how big are these? How big is the impact potential of these topics to your business? Then understand what you're already doing about where do you stand? To what degree are you already putting in, for example, safety statistics? You may be well down the road of doing things around safety and health, but maybe perhaps not so much around taking care of waste, for example. So you have a sense of where to focus your time and attention and money. Start to gather data and build management and governance systems so that you can actually begin to track progress and report on the progress to the stakeholders that matter the most, and then set up the capabilities so that you can actually report effectively and, to the extent that you need to, obtain third-party verification of what you're reporting on. So these are the very concrete things that we recommend that companies undertake. So this was what we were hoping to do today, is give you a sense of what's going on in the extraction sector and the intersections with ESG. And so what's next? What we would advise is evaluating where your company sits in sustainability adoption, and to the degree that you do need it, get some help, because this is we've passed the tipping point on ESG across almost every sector, and change is coming for sure. Ed, do you want to just talk a little bit about some of the things that we might be able to do to help?
We know that this is a big undertaking for many organizations, and it really does depend on where you're at in your sustainability journey. We help our clients everywhere from, can you do a maturity assessment of what we have in place today, through to, can you identify stakeholders and help us with our consultation with the stakeholders, or how do we take the large breadth of ESG topics and understand which are most material to us that we should focus on. That would then say, how do we apply it through which global sustainable framework that we want to embrace, right down to help us create a report so we can communicate with those stakeholders. That last culmination at the bottom right of your screen, if and when you are required to have some type of third-party verification, like what Mary said, in terms of validating and verifying what you're reporting, we can also help in that regard as well. So there's many different places we can be involved. If you have questions, we are definitely here. Our contact information will be shared. And Mary, I have to tell you, it's always exciting to address something like this with the group who are involved today. And it's also great presenting with you too. Thank you for the opportunity. It's been really nice to join with you today.
Hello, welcome to the second presentation. This is going to be a deep dive into the cannabis industry, and I'm here, my name is Mary Larson. I'm here with my colleague, Edward Olson. Ed?
Thanks, Mary. Hi, everyone. My name's Edward Olson. I am the leader of the sustainability practice here at MMP. I'm also a regional leader of enterprise risk services, and that covers all good topics around governance, risk, and compliance in my region. I've been a chartered accountant by trade over the last 24 years, and I've been dealing with a lot of different elements of sustainability, everything from auditing sustainability audits, environmental management systems, carbon credits, and during this time as well, I've been responsible for the strategy and operations related to running an alternative energy company. I also sit as a member of CPA Canada's Sustainability Reporting Advisory Committee, and am a member of the Global ESG Advisory Committee with the Institute of Internal Auditors. So with all of that being said, I'm really happy to be here to discuss ESG with you today.
And I'll just introduce myself briefly. I am a partner in the consulting practice of MNP, and I'm the national leader of our organizational renewal practice, which includes strategy and scenario planning and organization design, and most importantly, the strategy, ESG strategy practice. And Ed and I work together very closely to provide full services in the ESG domain. I've been involved in sustainability for about 20 years, was a co-founder of the Finance and Sustainability Initiative in Montreal, which was helping finance executives become more savvy and expert in the whole area of ESG. And one of the things that we feel very strongly about, and we'll talk about today, is that there is a basically maturity curve that people are going up and launching themselves into with respect to ESG. And we're going to talk about cannabis specifically today.
Thanks, Mary. Now that everybody has a good idea of who they're looking at on screen, here's some of the objectives. We want to cover with you today some of the many ESG topics and trends that are impacting the cannabis industry, including how to respond to these topics and suitably mitigate any potential exposures in your approach and your response to these topics with your stakeholders. We also want to take a look at some specific measures that you can consider in your own approach to ESG reporting. So, Mary, maybe you can kick things off with a reminder of what ESG is all about in case our viewers haven't seen our original presentation.
Right. So the environmental is the area I think that people are right now paying most attention to, and These cover a whole range of areas, including energy efficiency, the carbon footprint, water usage, which, by the way, is something that's very relevant to cannabis, waste management, packaging, which would also be something that would be relevant to many of you. But these social and governance issues are equally important. And these include things like employee attraction and retention, the employee brand, diversity and inclusion, which is something that is at the top of the list of business interests these days. Organizational culture is smack dab in the middle of social issues. And then there are governance issues. And these are things that senior executives and boards and employees need to be thinking about with respect to regulatory compliance on climate change, for example, cybersecurity, responsible taxes, and certainly reliable financial disclosure. So all of these things are relevant to ESG and the cannabis industry. Ed, do you want to talk a little bit about just kind of how we got to here today?
Yeah, and it's interesting to watch because we don't have to go further back than 1970, where the whole idea of the reason a company exists is just purely for the benefit of the shareholder. And in the early 70s, this whole idea of corporate social responsibility came out with the idea of social contract, that no, it's more than shareholders. There's this idea of being a good corporate citizen. So if we jump to the triple bottom line in the mid 90s, that's where this evolution came from. Well, what is social contract? Well, that social contract now includes bottom line, people, planet. What was revolutionary is that it was the idea that those three parts are equal. So the equality of bottom line, people, and planet. And a new movement began to dominate this whole corporate landscape in 2005, and that's what we're here to talk to you about. This is where ESG expanded the three categories to enable businesses to really measure the real, sustainable, and societal impact of their outputs. The difference now, though, is that ESG, well, it's measured, it's quantifiable, and criteria-led, and it allows businesses to better integrate the idea of ESG strategies into their actual corporate environment, their operating DNA. And Mary's going to talk a little bit more about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals later on in this presentation. But what I'll mention is that these 17 goals are global goals that represent a universal call to action to end things like poverty and protect the planet and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity. And they've even set a timeline for the UN SDGs around setting it for 2030. Mary, there's a lot of drivers.
And this is what's interesting is we've reached a tipping point, and in fact we're on the other side of that tipping point. I know that when we started talking about responsible investment 20 years ago, or impact investment, it was, the amount of money going into impact investment was in the 0.002% or thereabouts. But something has happened, and there's been a confluence of factors that are driving ESG, and to some extent, COVID was a contributor to this, and certainly the discussion we've been having around climate change was a huge contributor. If you think about all of the forces, government is there, and employees to some extent, I think, are looking to work in safe environments and caring about whether their management teams are doing the right things. Regulators and investors, however, are hugely important at this point. The regulators are embedding sustainability measures into their regulatory decisions and approvals for new projects. And investors have really gotten on board, whether this is institutional investors or smaller investors. The degree to which investment decisions are being made after scrutiny of sustainability strategies is growing by leaps and bounds. And to some extent, customers, certainly in the B2B arena, customers are becoming more attentive. Securities commissions and exchanges are beginning to take note as well. We did some research recently in which we looked at 108 exchanges around the world. About half of those, 64, or actually more than half, have SME listing programs. And of that 64, it was really interesting. 1/3 of them require ESG reporting as a listing rule. And more than half of them have written guidance on what needs to go into ESG reporting. So these things are moving, again, very, very quickly. Ed, do you want to talk a little bit more about the cannabis industry?
Yeah, and a really great thing to do for even some of you who probably are aware of this is to get a bit of a history on how we got to where we're at in the cannabis industry in Canada. And I'll begin by, we don't need to go back further than 1923, but cannabis has officially been banned in Canada since 1923, and that's until medical cannabis became legal in 2001. In fact, cannabis became illegal at a time when actually few Canadians had even heard of the substance. Police actually did not report seizing cannabis until 1932, and the first possession offenses did not occur until 1937. So in the years leading to legalization, surveys actually showed that between 40 and 70% of Canadians wanted recreational cannabis use made legal. In 2000, the Ontario Court of Appeal, they decided that cannabis prohibition was unconstitutional because it didn't make the exemption for medical use. So Health Canada responded to that ruling the following year when it regulated access to cannabis for licensed patients who were permitted to grow their own cannabis and actually access it from licensed producers. So in 2013, new federal regulations allowed for the production and distribution of medical cannabis, creating a licensed commercial industry here in Canada. And in 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada decided that it was unconstitutional to restrict medical patients to smoking just dried cannabis. So this ruling made it legal for licensed producers to make cannabis oils and other products made from cannabis extracts. It also made it legal to add cannabis to foods and drinks. So in 2016, the federal government created the Task Force on Marijuana Regulation and Legalization, which led to what you now know as Bill C-45, the Cannabis Act in 2018. Introduced in 2017 and was legalized in 2018 after Parliament passed the bill. So that's the quick, how did we get to where we're at here today? Mary, there's a couple overarching trends we should keep in mind as we go throughout this. Can you address those?
So now that the market is legal, there are other challenges that you know better than we do. But so the whole issue of management of supply, the competitive branding, making sure that it's clear who you're selling to, and certainly management of costs in the face of downward pricing pressure, things that all of you are dealing with in one way, shape, or form. But with respect to ESG, there are really three things that we want to talk about. One of them is that there still is a stigma surrounding the industry, and this is probably going to be with us for quite a while. There's a stigma around alcoholic beverages as well. So this is something that many industries need to deal with, both with the public and with policymakers. There's also a big desire to displace the illegal market. Federal government cares about this because the legal market is a source of tax income, but certainly illegal illicit markets are not seen as having control over environmentally oriented issues. And so that's a factor actually in favor of those of you who are in the legal market. But the bottom line is that, and we feel quite strongly about this, is that implementing ESG practices will be a fabulous way to think about attracting non-traditional capital and will help satisfy consumer and employee expectations. And those things will go a long way to reducing the stigma that exists around the industry still. So we're going to go more deeply into the environmental issues first and then the social and governance. Ed?
Thanks, Mary. What I would say even before I start jumping into some of these topics is what's important to keep in mind is that each of these that we're going to discuss today, they can be both risks as well as opportunities. For example, energy consumption and product packaging, yes, they're material environmental risks, but they also offer opportunities to reduce costs or increase revenues through the treatment or the use of that energy and the packaging. So it's important to keep in mind the exposures as well as the opportunities to reduce impacts, reduce costs, even find innovative ways to produce, which could result in opportunities to pivot and grow market share too. So let's look at a few of these topics that you'll see even outlined in your screen right now. And I'll put my focus first on outdoor growing, because figures provided by Health Canada just in April this year showed there's at least 110 outdoor marijuana cultivation licensees across the country. That's up from 42 a year ago. So soil, dependent upon your agricultural practices, those practices could be destructive through soil erosion, nutrient loss, reduction in organic carbon stored within the soil, and even increased acidity, to mention just a few soil-related considerations. We know that cannabis plants are susceptible to pests and disease outdoors, so you need to consider that the use of pesticides or even synthetic fertilizers can further destroy soil health. Well, what about water contamination? Well, outdoor farming practices can and do rely on water supply from artificial irrigation. And because of this, there is naturally a runoff that can bring negative impacts. And what are those negative impacts? Well, we're dealing with the wastewater can carry pesticides, heavy metals, excess nutrients, and even pollutants. So you want to be very cognizant around, well, what are we using for irrigation? What are the potential runoffs? How do we protect ourselves from polluting beyond our boundary of our organization? If we look at indoor farming practices, they can put pressure on municipal water systems from the discharge of excess nutrients and industrial cleaners. It's increasing stresses on wastewater treatment facilities in your community, and also leading to increased carbon emissions as the water is treated. So the actual emissions from the treatment of the water that came from your operation. So understanding both water consumption as well as where your wastewater goes is really important to evaluate your company's environmental footprint. And by mapping your footprint, this exercise provides a really good idea of what your impacts are in the life cycle of that water resource, among many other natural resource considerations. So, okay, let's look at indoor growing now. We can't get away from discussing energy use of what Mary referred to earlier. So depending on the production methods you employ, cannabis can be an energy intensive crop and is. And this intensity requires access to reliable sources of energy. And those sources of energy come from many different generation types that have different, what we call scope 2 greenhouse gas implications through indirect emissions being included in your carbon footprint, which need to be considered. So applicable to both indoor and outdoor growing is even the idea of reduced air quality. Volatile organic compounds, or the VOCs, they're emitted from cannabis plants as they grow, as well as during extraction through the use of solvents in the process. So VOCs, they contribute to the formation of ground level ozone, which also has a direct threat to public health and the environment. So how you track, control, and mitigate VOCs is really quite critical in your sustainability strategy. And last for this slide, we should consider waste production. The primary source of waste generated by the cannabis industry is a result of single-use consumer packaging on products. And we have to be aware that regulatory requirements are imposed on packaging types. That makes it difficult to reduce waste because you're mandated. I understand that. But these difficulties cannot tie our hands. It means we need to be innovative in our approach to reducing waste while still remaining compliant with all laws and regulations. So, Ed, what do we do? Well, I spoke about some of the key risks and topics that we face, but now look at some of the opportunities to mitigate these in your ESG journey. Going back to soil degradation, the adoption of regenerative agricultural practices and even land use planning needs to identify the short, the medium, and even the long-term impacts of planting decisions that can reduce the risk of soil degradation. Continuous soil testing can also inform decisions on how to optimize soil health. So what is your approach to measure and mitigate impacts to soil? If outdoor growing is applicable to you, you're going to need a strategy. If we look at preventing water contamination and reduced water use, cannabis producers can focus on using the minimum required amount of water for cultivation and other uses. This includes methods for automated irrigation. It includes capturing excess water for reuse that can reduce waste. And with all agricultural practices, one standard approach to water use and application of fertilizers and pesticides is not necessarily the best practice. Understanding that use and application can change by geolocation on your land should be considered to meet that location's exact needs to grow your crop. So continuous water treatment and quality testing really does reduce the likelihood of discharging contaminated water into the environment. How about reducing waste? Well, cannabis manufacturers and retailers should be sharing best practices and looking at innovative ways together to work on reducing packaging waste. This can include the ultimate consumer too, through offering to them take-back packaging programs as a potential option. The question you need to answer is, well, ask and answer, do you know what waste you create and where it goes? And knowing the answers to that, there are options for the treatment of even biomass by turning it back into fertilizer for reintroducing into the growing cycle that can be considered for you. Couple more thoughts on this slide. For indoor growers and producers, yes, you want to be considering LED lighting and HVAC systems. This should also consider optimizing space and scheduling the use of high energy equipment around peak demand. And understanding peak demand can help you reduce energy usage and energy costs to take advantage of lower energy rates. What about alternative energy sources? I'll have you factored in the idea of what alternative energy through wind and solar and biomass and other options versus traditional energy sources. Are you considering that? How is it being implemented into your energy consumption? Last, around the air quality, there are several technological innovations that can be leveraged to reduce emissions. It's cold traps, it's condensers, there's a lot of different technology, but the use of those systems, and I just need to pause for a moment here, they need to be balanced with the energy required for their use. Controlling air quality while driving up the energy use of energy, it's actually mitigating one risk of air quality while introducing another of consuming more energy. So this is about creating a comprehensive solution through looking at the interrelationship of environmental risks and choosing a course that achieves the best consolidated outcome. So Mary, that's a lot about environment. Maybe you can take us through some of the social considerations in the S pillar of ESG.
Right, thank you. I should just mention we have a detailed presentation with the content that we're delivering, which we will be sending out as well. So the detail that Ed just went through will be included in the written document that we send to anybody who's attended this. So let's talk about social impacts, and this is a really interesting set of topics because the cannabis industry is unique within society and has some complex issues to deal with. The criminalization history of cannabis is one that is complex, and so it's quite clear that many racialized communities, minority communities, have been disproportionately criminalized by cannabis in the past. And there is a concern over how these groups will react to legalization and how the rest of society will react. And so one of the things that has happened is that there has been an increase in cannabis-related offenses since the Cannabis Act has taken place. And so this is a complex sort of social issue that I think a lot of people are spending a lot of time trying to dig into and unravel. The other thing that is problematic with respect to criminalization is that in some cases it is difficult to hire people into senior levels who have had criminal records in the past because there is a requirement for a security clearance. And a criminal record check is part of this. So there are a whole bunch of complex societal issues around criminalization. We talked about the societal stigma. I think that this is the notion that society has that around stereotypes that cannabis users are lazy or dangerous or somehow less intelligent, and so this is going to affect potential buyers in the industry. Safety concerns with usage are definitely out there. I think that people are looking for demonstrated proof from the healthcare sector, for researchers, but some of the things that have been talked about are how cannabis usage can impair a user's ability to drive safely or to operate equipment, that the THC in cannabis actually impairs coordination, reaction time, decision-making abilities, and the ability to judge distances, and that some of these concerns are higher related to younger people. And that there may be some longer-term health effects associated with use, such as inability to concentrate or ability to think, and even lung issues. And then shifting user demographics. One of the things that as user patterns shift to different age levels or different income levels and geographies, the reasons for use are fluctuating. So a greater perhaps focus on medical applications, health applications, which could benefit the sector. But there is a risk in accidentally targeting and attracting groups who shouldn't be using cannabis, such as those under the age of 18. So in this sort of morass of complex social issues, what are some of the things that can be done and that are being done? So there are ways to mitigate the effects of criminalization. In some jurisdictions, equity models have been deployed so that the industry is accessible to individuals who've been victimized by the war on drugs. And so if they've been charged with a conviction or lived in an area with a disproportionately high rate of cannabis arrests, there are programs to ensure that these individuals are helped, and that perhaps that there are opportunities for them to work. Ensuring that leadership teams within cannabis companies are diverse and representative of minority groups, it can be a much more effective way to ensure that companies are seen as being responsive to societal issues. Just in terms of how to, over the nearer term, to reduce societal stigmas, the effort that is underway to produce evidence that shows the benefits of using cannabis will go a long way to reducing stigma. There are other things that are being done to position cannabis as a socially acceptable product through advertising and making sure that store locations are in areas of a city that are on busy streets next to other attractive retailers. And engaging with the communities that you're producing the product in is another way to build positive social relationships. We've talked a little bit already about the idea of mitigating safety concerns related to usage. I think that drawing on research and talking about the things that the positive effects of using cannabis, and showing how safe deployment of cannabis can mitigate some of the risks that are being talked about is an important thing to do. And I think perhaps most importantly, it's ensuring that the quality of the products that are being sold are as rigorous as possible, so that if you can demonstrate that you're using very, very high quality standards and checking standards to ensure product safety, that will go a long way to mitigating concerns about the safety of usage. Corporate health and safety programs for employees and for other users can also be an attractive thing to do. Another important activity that cannabis producers can pursue is to make sure that their marketing campaigns, their product development, all of the packaging, anything that relates to communicating to the consumer needs to be carefully thought through and seen as being highly responsible, particularly with respect to not targeting youth. And investing in research to identify consumer trends, for example, aging populations, the aging baby boomer population, and how they might think about using cannabis in a responsible way would be things that would be certainly attractive in trying to enhance the reputation of the industry. So complex, not necessarily clear and measurable things that could be done, but certainly there are some that would be clear and measurable around safety, packaging, and communication. So let's talk about governance, Ed.
Thanks, Mary. It seems like we're peeling this onion back. We've covered the E and the S, so let's get into the G. Given the relatively new nature of the legal industry for cannabis here in Canada, cannabis companies are perceived as less mature and often lack good corporate governance, and that creates a lack of tolerance by investors for missing good governance. Cannabis companies are often led by founders with limited experience navigating growth and propelling startups into larger companies, including seeking investors and being publicly listed. The topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion, yes, it is a social topic that ends up in the S pillar of ESG, and yet it's also a governance issue in that cannabis companies need to strategize on their current workforce strategy. What is the makeup of the board down through the entire organization? Is there representation of the communities you work in as well as the customers you serve? You need to consider your strategy to take your company from a startup of like-minded leaders to a diverse environment of leaders that is inclusive of all types. And good corporate governance is also good compliance. The combination of high growth and high regulation associated with the industry creates a need for everybody. It's manufacturers, distributors, retailers to deal with a high volume of laws and regulations. And not just to know the existence of those laws and regulations, but to also be aware when they change and the implication of those changes on your operating environment. Are you responding in time? Non-compliance can shut a business down. So how good is your governance for overseeing compliance and ensuring compliance practices are and actually remain robust? Governance extends beyond compliance to looking at other risks such as theft and product tampering and resale on the black market. Companies that are seeking to be publicly listed need to keep in mind the requirements of regulators for ensuring sufficient internal controls over financial reporting. Will your CEO and CFO be able to certify on the control environment for financial disclosures, ensuring that those controls are designed and appropriately, are they operating effectively? And last for this slide, let's remember it takes capital to operate a business and grow. Attracting investors is challenging within the cannabis industry due to a large volume of new entrants into the market. And I would even say investor uncertainty given the risk of investing in less mature companies. But you need the skills to communicate clearly with investors and to create required disclosures, and then the skilled team to back up and ensure that all is working as designed and communicated to investors and other stakeholders. So what about mitigations in this arena? Well, boards need to identify the skills and experience they and the management team require. And that's to enable success and growth, both at the current, I would say the current state and future trajectory. Company founders may need to be replaced by leaders with more experience. What is good as an entrepreneur is not always aligned with growing and maturing a company. And don't forget the need of necessary skills of accounting and information technology and human resources to manage those operational risks as a company. I already spoke about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Look internally. Do you have any formal guidelines or policies addressing how boards should be comprised to include various ages, races, genders, or other forms of diversity? And if you don't have a formal approach, you need to look at creating one. The board should contain experience in risk management and compliance to ensure the right questions of management are even asked, and that the right evidence is received to back up management statements and opinions. And dependent upon your size, for larger organizations, that's when you even start considering internal audit departments. You should invest in compliance. Is there an employee group that is focused solely on compliance, testing of compliance, and reporting to the board as well as management? And last but not least here, boards should implement disclosure practices and guidelines. And I say that to ensure investors are provided with relevant, timely, and accurate information. But boards can only do this if management has the right processes in place. So all of that being said, I'm going to take you quickly. If you were in attendance at our original presentation, we talked about the 6 main global ESG standards and frameworks. We just want to focus on SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, because they have a materiality map. And SASB is now part of the new merged Value Reporting Foundation. So if you hear those terms, that's where SASB sits. By selecting the industry in the materiality map called agricultural products, we can review and assess those topics that may have direct correlation to the cannabis industry. And some of those are displayed here on screen for you. And I'll go through a couple more of these over the next 2 slides. You can see here, we've already talked about greenhouse gas emissions, energy management, including water and wastewater treatment earlier in this presentation. The approach to understanding these impacts and how they are measured will help with ultimate sustainability practices and eventual disclosure. If we look at part of the social and governance pillars of ESG, that includes cybersecurity and data security as well. Do you have policies and procedures defining your approach to protecting your technology infrastructure as well as the information contained within it, or your treatment of confidential information from customers and your employee personal information? If you don't, you need to. And last but not least, what is your approach to employee health and safety? Do you record incidents, including near misses? Your approach to employee safety drives how you are viewed in the social pillar of ESG, and this extends to the measures you implement to protect your customers. Beyond health and safety approaches and measurements is your supply chain. What do you, or who do you do business with? What is your influence on the sustainability practices? And have you evaluated the implications of their sustainable practices or lack thereof on your business model? In understanding your carbon footprint, you will eventually be required to include what is called Scope 3 emissions, and that's indirect emissions that come from your supply chain. So it's important to really understand who you're working with, including your footprint, to have a better, more comprehensive overview of your business. Mary, around additional standards.
Right, and I think you all know that the Cannabis Act is something that you all need to comply with, because it basically sets the framework for legal access to cannabis, the control and regulation of production, distribution, sale, and all the regulatory requirements around production practices and SOPs, standard operating procedures. What's interesting is that many of the elements around SOPs actually relate to ESG, so that by adhering to the Cannabis Act, you can go a long way down the road of addressing ESG topics such as the sanitation of the buildings, employee hygiene, production, the addition of fertilizers, pest controls and harvesting, sampling and quality testing, packaging and labeling, and storage. So that is a good way to start with respect to the things you absolutely have to pay attention to. They are ESG related elements, which is a helpful thing. And there are some things already going on in the industry. Chiron has recently published an ESG report, which is showing lots of serious commitment to sustainability. Rubicon recently released an ESG report, and now we're even seeing recommendations about which stocks to buy because they are ideal for ESG investors. So this is something that's definitely being taken on as a challenge by the marketplace.
So now this is our chance to try and bring it all home, because I know we've given a lot to everybody attending today to consider around ESG topics for the industry. We wanted to close with providing this slide as a brief overview of key considerations that you really should evaluate on your ESG journey and your ESG strategy creation. I would say these are the building blocks to final external disclosures that will eventually become potentially mandated in Canada. If we take a view of your business to know where you operate, who is impacted by your business, or what we call stakeholders, what topics apply to your industry, and we've been covering some of those today, which are the most material to your business, taking those most material and evaluating what is being done today by you and your organization to address those topics, and if you aren't doing anything, you should. And ultimately, the idea of building a robust management system to synthesize and provide necessary data for reporting. All of these things are required and should be a part of your ESG journey. So next steps, we definitely appreciate your time today, and look at the information that we've asked and presented to you, and ask yourself in your organization, what are we doing? Are you identifying, embracing, and managing these ESG topics? If you haven't created a strategy, I would say don't wait. The time to start is now, and get third-party help from organizations like MNP. Mary, I know we'll chat just briefly here at the end around what are some of the things even organizations like us can do to help you on your journey.
Right. So yes, and there are other organizations that can do these kinds of things, but we've invested a great deal in building our capabilities along several dimensions. One is a baseline to maturity journey, which is starting with an assessment of where you stand with respect to ESG, and identifying a desired state of maturity and laying out a strategic plan to achieve that level of maturity that you've chosen, and training the board and management in the area of ESG. We also do a lot of work with stakeholders, identifying the ones that you need to really pay attention, and understanding what their concerns are through stakeholder consolidation, and creating a stakeholder engagement framework that can be used over the long run so that you stay connected with these stakeholders. We can also look at the impact of your current situation. So materiality assessments, linking ESG topics to corporate value and risks, and undertaking benchmarking to see where you stand with respect to disclosures and other players in the marketplace. We can help you select the frameworks that are most appropriate for you. We used SASB today, but it's not the only one that's out there, and we did cover that in our earlier presentation. And then reporting and making sure that there is the way that you're reporting the information is useful and meets regulatory and legislative requirements, and assurance, finally, doing the third-party verification assurance of ESG reporting. So pretty much along the gamut of issues that issuers such as yourselves might be facing. So thank you so much. We hope this is helpful, and obviously if you have any questions, concerns, I think you've got our coordinates, and we would be happy to speak with you any point in time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for joining us for today's presentation of ESG in the capital markets, cannabis, and mining. As well, I'd like to thank our valued partners, MNP, and their subject matter experts, Mary Larson and Edward Olson. As well, special thank you to Richard Carlton and Mark Faulkner for giving us their expertise on Day 1 ESG, a macro overview. If you like this content or you missed out on Day 1, please visit us at www.thecsc.com, as well as our YouTube channel, CSE_TV. Thank you and good night.